Welcome to interactive draft number 2, aka iDraft. This time around, it's going to be the Warrior.
Victory or death!
Warrior is one of the classes which increased in power in Arena after the Naxxramas expansion because one of the best class cards, Death's Bite, is on it. And you might think, oh, that's just one card, but it is a common card, so you see it quite often, and Warrior, pre-Nax and also post-Nax, gets most of its card advantage via weapons, so having another good weapon show up into the pool is very good. For these iDrafts, remember you can pause the video and take a bit longer to think of the picks than the given time. If you need it, I usually spend way more time than the timer, and you can move the video / timer forward by clicking on your choice if you have an insta pick. Alright, let's go. Alright, first pick we have the best Warrior epic in the game, but I'll go left to right. Shield Slam is a fine card. Decent removal. I like the card. Gorehowl is the best Warrior class card. It's the best epic slot, in fact. You get so much card advantage with it. And Molten Giant is reasonable in Warrior, although, well, it is dependent on how many weapons you have in Warrior. I would probably pick Shield Slam over Molten Giant for what it's worth at this point. I think it would actually be really close. Very easy pick here. The Dark Iron Dwarf is a fantastic 4-cost, counted as a 6/4, which is the highest stats in the game for the forest slot, basically. Of course, it's not permanent 6/4, but the temporariness of it often is good enough. Unstable Ghoul is okay in terms of looking at all the cards in this rarity level, and Heroic Strike is also okay, but Dark Iron Dwarf is just far, far better. Whirlwind does not do enough to justify a card slot. The 1 damage to all minions often doesn't do enough. The Battle Rage is also weak. There have been some people who have commented, isn't it better than Arcane Intellect because it costs 1 less and you're usually going to have 1 damage friendly character, and if you have more then it's insane. And they're not wrong that when you have the instances where you have 1 damage friendly character out on the field are not that rare, and sometimes you can draw a lot of cards with it, and in some decks Battle Rage may be even better, but there are going to be many times where you can only draw 1 card off of Battle Rage because you yourself are the only one who's damaged, and it sucks then. Execute is a card which I think people overvalue. I actually may have undervalued it myself because I always used to think you need another card with it to actually be able to kill something, but it turns out that getting 1 random damage on various things it happens, and it's a good card, although I wouldn't want too many of them. Young Dragonhawk is an extremely weak card with only 1 health and only 1 attack value. You can't really combo the Wind Fury with anything. Young Dragonhawk is one of the worst cards that you could pick in Arena. Spectral Knight, I would say, is overrated. People look at how good it is in Constructed and assume that it's that good in Arena, but it's worse in Arena because getting targeted by spells or hero powers isn't as big of a deal. Oftentimes just a 5-mana 4/6, and I would pick Spectral Smith over it, certainly in this deck. Harvest Golem is a very, very strong 3-mana, 2/3, very solid. It'll always be there for you. We've got Battle Rage again, which again doesn't look like it's going to do much. Direwolf Alpha is my pick of choice here. It tends to be better in a aggressive-ish deck, since you'll want to have a lot of guys out and then play the Direwolf Alpha and then buff them and then send them in. Currently, this deck could go either way on it, but it just turns out the Direwolf Alpha is better than the Gurubashi Berserker, which is very slow to get going. And in Arena, you are okay with having things that are slow to get going, but just not quite that slow. A weak pack here, Silverback Patriarch, is a classic trap card where people want to pick up Taunt. I tend to think of Taunt as completely optional in all arenas. The stat value on the Silverback Patriarch is extremely poor. Reckless Rocketeer, costs too much mana, 6 mana, deal 5 damage effectively, not that great. Drangling Mechanic is also not a very strong card, but it is the strongest of the bunch. Against classes which cannot deal 1 damage, it is the same stat value as Yeti. Although, because it summons a 2/1, it tends to be quite a lot worse than Yeti, because there are, I'd say about 50% of the classes can deal with the Mechanical Dragonling with their hero ability. And that's including Paladin, since their 1/1 takes out the Mechanical Dragonling sometimes. I think that quite a lot of people overvalue the Leper Gnome. 1 mana, 2/1 is no good. Any card with 1 health in my book is not good. I shouldn't say any. Most cards with 1 health are not good, and Leper Gnome is one of them. It turns out that Arena is slow enough that it doesn't matter if they take their turn 2 to take down your Leper Gnome. And yes, you do an extra 2 damage to them, and you stop their turn 2, but their card advantage is worth it. The Ironforge Rifleman is also poor, the stats are bad, and the Battle Cry doesn't do enough. The Shield Block is a nice filler card. Any card that says draw a card can be considered, certainly, and this one has a nice small bonus effect. Worth mentioning that this is a very bad play on turn 3. You want to continue to develop your threat, so usually you'll play your Shield Block in the late game, preferably also while you're using your hero ability to get the bonus armor also. Oasis Snapjaw is an acceptable card, generally. Far better than it, though, is the Stranglethorn Tiger, which is a nice 5 mana 5/5. In addition, it starts off stealth, which means you get to choose the favorable exchange with the Tiger. Nice bonus is it also stays out of Flame Strike range. Acolyte of Pain, you may see it a lot in Constructed Warrior, but the reason why it's not so good in Arena is because you rarely can take advantage of drawing multiple cards off of it unless you're a mage. Alright, this pick is quite difficult. I would say on paper, if we were to just rank the cards, I would be tempted to take Execute, as I think it is the strongest card here. Hard removal, but the problem is there's already 1 Execute in the deck, and that's one of those cards which I think devalues quite a lot once you get 1 of, because you don't want to get stuck with too many. There's a similar problem with Shield Block, where having the utility of a Shield Block is nice, but having multiple may not be that great. The Raging Worgen is a card that I think many people also overvalue, in that it is simply a 3 mana 3/3, and I'd say the ability doesn't go off very often. However, with Naxxramas, there is a slightly higher chance for the ability to go off just off of your opponent's minions, because they could run something like Spectral Creeper, Haunted Creeper rather. With Naxxramas, there's just generally lower attack value minions with Death Rattles, so I'll take the Raging Worgen here. Although I think this is a very close pick between all 3 cards. In this pack, we've got Mana Addict, also known as Mana Baddict. First of all, there are only 2 spells in this deck. Warriors tend not to get many spells, but it doesn't even matter if you have a lot of spells, because if you play the Mana Baddict and your opponent has a 2 mana 3/2 out, then they kill your Mana Addict and they still have their minion. And that's why Mana Addict is really bad. Young Priestess is a card which is probably one of the best 1 health minions that you can pick in Arena, but I personally still think it's quite poor just because of the free card that you give your opponents. So the Mortal Strike is the choice here. Mortal Strike is a less exciting fireball, but it's playable at least. This pack features another Dark Iron Dwarf, which is a lovely card. I would pick quite a lot of Dark Iron Dwarfs. Worth mentioning that the Dark Iron Dwarf is better if you have a lot of early game minions so that you can actually have targets to buff it with on turn 4. There's a Dragonling Mechanic, which is weak, and there's a Spellbreaker. There are a few people in the school of thought who believe that silence is extremely powerful. I have tended to think that silence is optional, but I'm starting to move the Spellbreaker up in value a little bit. Regardless, though, the Dark Iron Dwarf is far too good to consider picking a Spellbreaker over. Okay, very exciting. Our first weapon in the arena. Weapons are the way that the warrior can get some massive card advantage. Well, not massive, but you get a 2-for-1 with Arcanite Reaper almost always. So, definite pick there. Warsong Commander is difficult to evaluate, but I think the weak stats on it and not being able to play it and it being more of a combo card means it tends to be weak in Arena. And Voodoo Doctor is a 1 mana 2/1, which is poor. This pick may surprise a few people. The Cruel Taskmaster looks pretty good as the warrior class card and has some nice utility to it. Dealing 1 damage to a minion, the ability to enrage the Raging Worgen is not lost on me. But I don't think it's the pick here. Bloodfin Raptor is a 2 mana 3/2, very nice and basic. And the reason why I'm going to lean towards the Bloodfin Raptor is we're almost halfway through the draft. And so far we have nothing in this deck that wants to be played on 2. The Cruel Taskmaster would not want to be played on 2 either. And it is really important, especially for a warrior, to play something on turn 2 because their hero ability is the worst in Arena. Magma Rager is a complete joke. You play it for 3 mana, they kill it with their hero ability for 2 mana. Undertaker tends to be quite poor in Arena, and in this deck there are no Death Rattles so far, so it is extremely poor. Dark Scale Healer is okay. Yeti stats with a nice battle cry, but better than that is Gnomish Inventor, which is a solid minion which can kill your opponent's 3/2s while drawing you a card, potentially getting you a 3-for-1 or 2.5-for-1. This pick is slightly tough. Slam is going to be my pick though. Slam is a very efficient spell. It deals 2 damage for 2 and draws a card. That's a really good deal. And sometimes you can play it on turn 2 to kill the opponent's 3/2. Nice flexibility there. The Dragonhawk is a joke. The Bloodsail Raider is the other card that I consider taking over Slam. For one, I consider taking it over Slam because it is a 2-drop that you can actually play on 2, which tends to be better than the reactive Slam. And as a warrior, there's the added bonus that the Bloodsail Raider could be quite buff. But I am going to go with the Slam instead. I think this is a close one though. Very easy pick in this pack, but I'll go over the choices. Stormpike Commando, 5 mana, 4/2. Bad stats, the battle cry is pretty good. Tends to be an average card. River Crocolisk is a card that you would actually want to pick in this deck because it is a 2 mana minion, but far better than the River Crocolisk is the Fiery Wind Axe. You tend to win more games the more Fiery Wind Axes you have in the deck, because this is a excellent early game card which takes out 2 of your opponent's early game cards, and your win percentage chances of winning the game go up significantly if you have this in your opening hand. Nothing too exciting in this pack. There is a Wolf Rider, which is 3 mana, deal 3 damage, basically. It's okay. It's on the weak side, certainly, but the other 2 cards may be even weaker. Ogre Magi, 4 mana, 4/4. We've got quite a lot of good cards in the 4 slot already, or perhaps not a lot of good cards, but we have cards in the 4 slot already. And a 4 mana, 4/4 is not very good. And a 2 mana, 2/2 is also quite poor. So we'll go Wolf Rider. Hungry Crab is extremely weak in Arena. The Murloc Dream just doesn't happen often enough. Mountain Giant is not a card that you can count on in Arena. Sometimes you'll top deck it late and it'll be unplayable, and most of the time you'll have to play it without having the unfair benefit of playing it on, say, turn 5 or 6. Faceless Manipulator is an excellent card, although in this deck it's slightly weaker because we don't have anything good to copy from ourselves, but it's good to have it against someone else's big stuff. A little bit tough. Kor'kron Elite is one of those cards which I think people might overvalue just because they look at the card border and they're like, oh man, this is a warrior class card, it must be really good. And it turns out that it is a pretty good card, and it's better in an aggressive deck because you can hit the face with it and it does a lot of damage early. It's not great when trading with minions because oftentimes most things can deal 3 damage. It's at its best when you run it into an Acolyte of Pain or something like a River Crocolisk and it survives to be able to do another attack, or when you have the board and you just play it and attack the face. But it's not the right pick here. The Youthful Brewmaster is going to actually be the pick of choice because currently in this deck, about 2/3 in, and I probably should have said this earlier, but in classes which cannot do something to affect the board, I enjoy having about 6 to 8 cards which can be played on 2 mana. And currently, we've got 3. So we're gonna need to pick up quite a few more of those. So the Youthful Brewmaster is basically the same as Bloodfed Raptor here, although it has a slight added benefit that it might return the Dark Iron Dwarves for added benefit, it might heal a guy, so even if I draw it late, it is better than Bloodfed Raptor. The Spellbreaker is okay, but doesn't match up to the other 2 cards. This deck currently has 3 spells in it, so Violet Teacher is not very strong, although a 4 mana 3/5 with a nice bonus ability never is too bad. The pick here is going to be Stampeding Kodo. There are some very, very sick Kodo targets in Arena that you can get, including Snapjaw Turtle and Gurubashi Berserker, which sometimes outright wins you the game, and sometimes even if you just kill a totem or you kill a 2/1 with it, you're getting some pretty good value, and the stats on it are pretty strong. I said a 4 mana 3/5 is okay. You add 1 mana to get that Battle Cry, that's well worth it. Injured Blade Master, 3 mana 4/4/3 is completely reasonable as well, if there weren't a better card in it. I'm just saying it's a reasonable card on average. This is a very disappointing pack to open. The pick here is going to be Wolf Rider, which is yet another 3 mana deal 3, which is, when you compare this to the Fiery War Axe, you can see how much better the Fiery War Axe. The Fiery War Axe costs 1 less mana, and you get to swing with it again after your first attack. But hey, sometimes you don't get Fiery War Axe, sometimes you get Wolf Rider. It's better than Mogushan Warden, which doesn't have enough attack to do anything, and it's better than Whirlwind, which is not justifiable as a card pick because it doesn't do enough on the card. This pick is a little bit tough. The Booty Bay Bodyguard is not the right pick because the stats are very poor for the mana cost. So it is between Cleave and Mad Bomber. The Cleave is my pick of choice because it's very efficient at what it does for the amount of mana that it does it in. Although the Mad Bomber is also not bad at all because the Mad Bomber can actually be played on turn 2. And it has the side benefit of dealing damage randomly split between characters, so you can sometimes Mad Bomber into an Execute. Of course, you can Cleave into an Execute as well. When I look at the amount of 2-drops I have so far, it's 4, if you don't count Direwolf Alpha, and I'm looking to pick up at least 2 more. The Cleave, though, is a way that you can catch up. And say you do skip your turn 2. Sometimes they play a 3-2 and then they play another 3-2 and then you get super Cleave value. So I'm going to choose the Cleave here, although I think it's very close. Boy, am I happy to see this card here. But going left to right, Shield Block is a fine card, usually filler. I'd pick it over Wolf Rider. And it's nice to just have the option sometimes to gain 5 armor if you have too much mana left over. Bloodfen Raptor is definitely the pick here. I was very torn between picking a 2 mana 3-2 the last pick. Happy to pick it up here. And the Stone Tusk Boar is really bad because the stats are very bad. And it is not worth a card. I consider this pick to be very, very difficult, and possibly either one can be justified. So Cruel Taskmaster is a nice utility card. 2 mana 2-2, sometimes it's a 2 mana 4-2, similar to the Dark Iron Dwarf when you use it on your own guy and you're about to trade into another guy. In addition, it activates Execute, which is a nice bonus. The Shattered Sun Cleric is one of those cards which just is really good by default. Not only is it a 3 mana 4-3 generally, because you'll use it to buff a minion, it's better than 3 mana 4-3 because a portion of that has charge, because you're putting it on a guy who presumably attacks immediately, generally. Of course, the Magma Rager is a complete joke. I'll pick the Shattered Sun Cleric as the card that I tend to put more value into. You've got Unstable Ghoul, which I think looks deceptively weak due to the only 1 attack on it. But the Death Rattle of deal 1 damage to all minions practically guarantees that it's actually 2 attack. Most of the time. You can play the Unstable Ghoul and it will usually trade with pretty much anything your opponent plays, if it's early game. And we are still looking for cards that can be used in the early game. In addition, it activates Execute and has some synergy with Raging Worgen. The Direwolf Alpha tends to be a card that's better in an aggressive deck, and this deck, although it's looking like it has a few 2-drops, I wouldn't qualify as aggressive. It doesn't actually have too many 2-drops which you play as minions. So oftentimes, especially as this is the second one, you might open with a Direwolf Alpha, and you don't want to just play a 2 mana 2-2. Razorfen Hunter is one of those cards which is weaker than it looks, mostly because the 1/1 boar is worthless to an extent. It's worth very little, so It's kind of a 3 mana 2/3. So I'm going to choose Unstable Ghoul here. Another rather disappointing pack. We've got Inner Rage, which doesn't do enough to justify playing it as a card even though it's free. Dancing Swords is a 3 mana 4/4, and that's great stats, although it has a very significant downside death rattle. Still though, I will pick it over the Windfury Harpy, whose stats are truly miserable, where you're paying an extra 2 mana for a Yeti the turn you play it. Somewhat on the weak side, but at least we have a 2 mana 2/3 in the Sunfury Protector, which is fine. The Battlecry ability tends not to matter too much, but it is better than Crocolisk. Cold Light Oracle has poor stats, and the mirror effect of drawing cards can't really be taken advantage of in Arena. Arcane Golem, this deck isn't fast enough to take advantage of the charge. It's not really a rush down deck, although the more I look at it, the more and more aggressive this deck seems. It's got 2 Wolf Riders, and the endgame curve isn't very strong. And it's got a Mortal Strike. Kind of question to ask yourself is, can this deck actually survive in the late game? Usually I would like to get something along the lines of, usually in the generalist control deck, or I mean all Arena decks I tend to qualify as a kind of board control deck. I like to have about 7 cards, which are 5 and more for mana cost, so that in the late game you get something to do. Currently there's 5, and on average I probably get to pick 1 more in the next 3 picks after this one. The cards are pretty good, but they are on the low side, and they're just 5s, and I got a nice score howl at the end. It is possible that this is actually a big rush down deck. The significance of this choice is really big, because if you choose the Arcane Golem, your general deck mentality changes from one of trying to get the usual arena value into one where you're almost going all out to kill your opponent, because this card is quite poor if you're trying to go for the usual board control strategy. I will choose the Arcane Golem over the Sunfury Protector here after a lot of internal debate. I think that this will go for the face quite a few times, and sometimes it'll go trade with something and it won't be that much worse than the Protector. Even in the case that it's not all out rushy, perhaps it's fine. I was about to say that earlier in the arena, since I picked Arcane Golem, I'm a little bit sad that I didn't pick a Kor'kron Elite. But now the Kor'kron Elite is back, and of course the earlier pick of Bloodfen Raptor, I believe it was, over Kor'kron Elite, is not a mistake, because you do need to start off with a 2, and this deck still lacks a few 2s. But in this case, let's go through it left to right. Rampage isn't good enough because having a damaged minion is tough to set up in Arena. The Kor'kron Elite is very, very strong now that this deck is looking to have a much more aggressive tone to it. And of course it's just far better than the other picks of Mad Scientist, which is a 2/2. Another Dancing Swords, which is pretty good for the tempo deck, which this deck actually is looking to be now. Just have a lot of strong early game minions, and this card would go up significantly in value if not for the better card in this pick, which is not Voodoo Doctor, which is a 1 mana 2/1, but rather the Jungle Panther, which has a lot of attack to it anyways and starts off stealth, so it's better. This pick is almost borderline insane that I considered the Ravenholt Assassin, but let's start with the Pint-Sized Summoner, which is just a 2 mana 2/2. It has a nice bonus to it, but I think it's a bit too weak in the early game. The Sunwalker is your classic, very strong card. It's less good in Arena because there are many classes which, past constructed, will be able to do more 1 damage. There's more classes in Arena that deal 1 damage than constructed, I should say, due to constructed not having quite as many mages, rogues, and paladin druid to an extent. I was almost considering Ravenholt Assassin here because this looks like a nice finisher, and it is bigger than the Sunwalker, but the Sunwalker is still better, I would say. In addition, the Sunwalker protects a lot of these charging minions. You play the charge, and you attack onto an empty board ideally. They play a guy, you play the Sunwalker, and then you attack with your guy again. Plus, there are no 6 drops in this deck, so it fits a natural curve. It's a great card to pick up. I wouldn't have been sad with the Ravenholt Assassin either. Alright, and that's the deck. I would say that these picks were definitely below average in terms of quality. Instead of hoping for the Fiery War Axes, we were really happy to get Bloodfen Raptors, but sometimes you get below average. Instead of getting Fiery War Axes, you get Wolf Riders. And instead of getting like a Yeti, you get a Mortal Strike, or what's in the rare slot that a warrior wants? Something like an Azure Drake, or a Knife Juggler, or a Twilight Drake, or a Frothing Berserker, or some such. There are no Arathi Weaponsmiths or Death's Bites in this deck, and only 1 Fiery War Axe. But at the end game, you do have this fantastic looking Gorehow. This deck ended up being far more aggressive than I had even seen it develop, with early game many 3/2s. The 3 drops have Arcane Golem, Dancing Swords, Jungle Panther, and Raging Worgen, and 2 Wolf Riders, which are all strongly tilted on the aggressive side. The Mortal Strike is a finisher. The Dark Iron Dwarves now actually have some targets to hit. As you look at this curve, it's very tilted towards the early game. Got some nice finishers in the Reaper, the Tiger, and the Gorehowl. Overall, I'd say that though this deck is weak, in terms of picks, a cohesive theme was patched together, and it'll be able to run down more than just a few unsuspecting victims, I'd say. I'm going to predict that this deck will... I won't predict that this deck will do too well, but we're going to make do with what we have, and I'm going to hope for 6 wins with this deck.